Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series, where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the one-shot adventure Real Dungeons #1, The Buried Palace, designed by Peter Charron for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This review has been sponsored by the publisher, and a review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you are interested in a sponsored review, please reach out via email, Twitter, or Discord, or my submission form at roguewatson.com. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. What are real dungeons? Well, those are dungeons based on real-world locations in our own history. In this case, this particular dungeon is based on the Domus Aurea, which is a palace constructed by Emperor Nero of Rome. There's a really fun little history lesson portion here at the beginning, which, by the way, I really like. The designer immediately answered my question when I cracked this thing open. I was like, well, what the hell do you mean real dungeon? I opened it up, I was like, what do we mean by real dungeons? Okay. I like that that's already included there, as well as this nice little history lesson about this palace that was constructed by Nero, which was never finished. It was just very opulent and ostentatious and decadent, and other words describing hedonism. And when he died, it was literally buried by his successors as kind of an embarrassment to nobility, and they just really wanted to ignore it and literally bury the truth of it. And then it was only discovered, I believe, centuries later. Somebody fell through somewhere and discovered there was this actually surprisingly well preserved, ancient palace that they could kind of wander through. So that's a neat idea, and then the designer has essentially D&Dified that idea into creating this pretty cool backstory as a one-shot adventure for around levels 3 to 4. I would probably err to say it's probably 3rd level. It feels a little bit easy, and I really like the story that's included here. The story, I don't know why I have my headphones on. I put my headphones on. Couldn't hear myself talk for a while. The story involves this cleric named Thessalon, who was apparently became very history smiled down on him, and he became a saint eventually. The religion is never quite defined, but it could be anything depending on whatever your campaign world is. But the truth is that he was actually this monstrous, overzealous, power-hungry usurper who ended up trying to take over the throne of whatever, again, local kingdom, which I do appreciate the kind of vague things here. It's not tied in any specific histories. I think that actually works pretty well for dropping adventures and dungeons. And in doing so, he rallied all his followers and tried to depose the queen, and the queen refused. She was holed up in a summer palace, and so he was able to curse her by, I guess, making a bargain with Orcus, who is a demon lord, which I guess at that point you are tied to the Forgotten Realms. And then they end up burying her in this palace, and then the curse has it so it kind of turns into a bit of a vampire monster, basically. Whenever she's around somebody, she kind of turns into this horrible monster and kills them. So that's a scary thought, to be put into a location like that and buried with that person. So it's a very creepy situation, and then that has happened however long ago, and then this other monastery has been built, and it's been, to his, and I guess the bad guy won basically in that case, because history again smiled well, and he's got his own monastery. But then the monks end up breaking into this basement area, and they realize this whole palace is here that has never been unearthed before, and one of the monks is killed, somehow mysteriously murdered, and then who are we going to call? The PCs are coming through to help us. So that's the backstory. I like that backstory. I think it's really cool. It's very intriguing. You've got this underground buried area. You've got this mysterious story where you're going to end up learning throughout different rumors of the region, as well as eventually the best case is there's a ghost of one of the guards that was a loyalist of the queen, who knows everything that the party can come across, and she can possess somebody and basically tell everything. And then eventually they can actually come across the queen and just talk to her about it, because she's still alive. She's kind of like this half undead form. So that part is all really, really cool. I was really on board with this adventure from the beginning. I thought it had a neat idea with the story and the way it would play out. And now it's time for the but. The but is that obviously I love dungeon crawls, right? That's what I'm all about. I really enjoy doing dungeon crawls, and I like an adventure that is mostly a dungeon crawl because I think dungeon crawls work really well in D&D. It's part of the name. This one, however, I think drops the ball by adhering too closely to the designer's wishes to make this a realistic dungeon. Because yes, I do think it's very realistic. Unfortunately, I think it also ends up being rather boring. It is a very, very large dungeon. It is 40 plus rooms, 3 different areas if we include. Confusingly, they start here on room number 1, which is attached to C, and then if you scroll all the way down to C as part of the basement, I believe you're supposed to take the party kind of cinematically through this area of C, not let them explore it first. And then they start in the actual, like, here's the breach in the wall, and we're going through and discovering that. Because if you let them explore here, they could stumble upon the final boss too early, because they actually have to come back out and then use a magic MacGuffin item to kind of destroy the final boss. So that part was a little confusing for me. I had to flip back and forth and realize where the party was supposed to start. But if you include that, even if you don't include the basement area, you're still looking at about 40 rooms. I do include it, so you're looking at about 45 rooms that you can explore. That is a huge dungeon, by the way. That was, I consider, a mega dungeon size. And most of them are empty, which is just crushingly disappointed, which, yes, I know that is realistic. If you're going through an ancient dungeon that has been buried for that long, most of the rooms are gonna be empty. I get it. But that's not very exciting to explore in a dungeon crawling way. Especially, I'm somebody who plays on a virtual tabletop. I can just picture my players going their little tokens on the map, opening a door. I read the description, there's nothing there. They go into the other door, I read the description, there's nothing there. It's just, this happens so many times. I literally did the math. Out of about 45 rooms, there were, give or take, I looked at 14 rooms with interactive elements. That could mean that you have to make a single check to find a thing that involves minor loot. That could mean there's a note you find that's got some environmental storytelling, or it can mean there's a monster there that you have to battle, or maybe a treasure chest that you get, or a combination of those things. 14 out of 45 is about a 30% rate of having anything to do other than DM reading a description. That to me is backwards. I feel like if you're designing a dungeon, you can have maybe 30% of the rooms be empty, not have 30% of the rooms have something in them. So that's a big problem for me, to where if I were running this dungeon, I would either permanently block off several of these rooms with rubble and just say, like, look, it's destroyed. You can include some of them, that's fine, especially the ones where there's, like, skeletons and remains and things that are at least interesting for the players to note. But you don't need them to be just wandering off the halls, just eating up time of not doing anything. And there's not even like there's a creepy atmosphere necessarily to where it's like they're being assailed by, nightmares or anything like that. That's really not the case at all. Although there are creepy elements, which is you discover that a lot of these people like died by a suicide, or it was some kind of tragic death where everybody was clearly trapped in here. And especially on this western portion, the half of the map, it's less scary because it's just people that just kind of maybe killed them by suicide. And then once you get to the eastern part, you realize it's been barricaded, and then you get to the kind of more monstrous part where clearly there's somebody that's been hunting and killing other people. So the environmental storytelling part is very good, but to me, it really drops the ball. Like, yes, you can use some in random encounters here, which I guess I would definitely want to play that up, but unfortunately it's not. These random encounters they're very random, right? It's the table, which I always hate. Like, yes, that's a part of D&D, is having these encounter tables, but if you're going to do that, then give me scripted encounters where those tables are actually used. Don't just say, hey, throw a thing of this at the players just to spice things up. That's to me, that's not enough for adding in content. Not enough. It doesn't make up for the fact that there's so many missing content from these rooms, which is a bummer. The actual murder that happened, that was the inciting incident, just a random dire badger. There's like a pair of those that are nesting. I don't know how the hell I got in here. Nesting about halfway in the dungeon. There's a bunch of bath pits, which are home to an ooze. That's it for the number of monsters in here. So again, if you're expecting like some kind of, undead dangers or anything else, none of that's happening here. None of that. And then the second half of the room, again, you've got the ghost, the guard ghost, which is very, very good. Hopefully the players find that, because that is a critically important, basically the only social NPC you get, other than the first beginning monk quest givers, and then the actual kind of half undead queen that can really tell you a lot of information and kind of prepare you for the half undead queen and everything, if you manage to stumble upon them. Otherwise, there's like a swarm of rats. There's a few treasure chests around. I don't think there's any traps. There's like maybe one minor crossbow trap or something at some point. It's just a place that hasn't been, it was just, the thing is, it's not like a lair or a creature, of anything going on. It was literally just a regular noble's palace, which was buried in the ground, and then one person was cursed to be a monster and kill the other. So that's the cool environmental story part, and that part's very cool. But there's not enough interesting environmental storytelling based on that, and then there's no real, I don't know, there's not a lot of danger or interesting elements that really kept my attention. When you get to the Queen's room, that is meant to be a social scene. I don't believe there's any notes if the characters decide to actually destroy her. Trying to remember. I don't think that's involved, which I was really curious, because there are some party members who might be like a zealous paladin or cleric who's like, oh, well, you're a pseudo undead. Is she actually considered undead? No, it's actually humanoid. Okay. But she kind of goes into this vampiric mode basically whenever she's around. Was it like young people or something? I don't know. I forget what the rules were exactly, but it's a problem. So I don't know if there's anything about. You could. The thing is, you could solve this adventure just by killing her and then leaving, and then you're done. Like, it's weirdly, there's not, the actual final boss threat isn't a threat really. It's just that her curse is still active, and in order to free her curse and kind of allow her to, I guess, die peacefully, is you have to take this oil from an oil lamp she gives you and then pour it on the Orcus ring that Thessalon was buried with. He had his hand chopped off and buried and entombed here in the palace. So you go all the way back out. You agree to do that, presumably. You go all the way, and she says, if you do this, I will then open up this secret room to get at my treasure. So you go all the way back out of the dungeon. You enter into the basement area. You get past the statues. I believe there's an earth elemental fight there, which can definitely help slow down the party's advances. And then you've got kind of an interesting boss fight where if you break inside, his hand, which has been severed and has the ring, will jump on, like basically fly off. And then he appears as I think it's a pretty unique stat block, Thessalon's Revenant. It's undead and got some spells it can cast. And then a swarm of rats comes out, swarm of undead rats. And the whole time you're trying to pour this oil on the hand, and then that will actually sanctify it and destroy it. And then I believe that actually destroys everything. So I like the side objective. And meanwhile, if he grabs the hand and attaches it, he gets to regenerate all his stuff, and he gets more superpowers and things. So that's kind of a neat idea for a boss fight. It probably needs to be a little bit harder. Maybe I'm trying to remember third level. I guess third level, depending on how they went with the earth elemental, I guess I would assume they short rest after that. So yeah, it might be appropriate. Fourth level, it might be easier for them, but I'm glad that Swarm of Undead Rats is there to help free things up, because I never like to have bosses who are alone. But I do like to have boss fights where there's a side objective. In this case, the side objective is trying to catch this crawling claw and then pour the oil on top of it in order to stop everything. It's a shame that kind of instantly... I think you, after he becomes whole... Okay, so maybe there's some rules about he doesn't instantly necessarily die. Let's see, the hand already at 0 hit points, Mr. Possessed Revenants takes 25 hit points. Okay, so it doesn't immediately die unless he's been attached to it before. But I think it's a cool boss fight, so I really like that. The way it ends, but I don't know. I wish there was just more to this dungeon. I think it works as a realistic dungeon. It definitely feels realistic, but it just feels too empty. It feels too big and too empty to be very interesting to explore. And then once you actually complete that boss fight, you then presumably have to go all the way back into the bottom of the dungeon, and then you speak to her and she gives you the rewards. So which I think that's an interesting development, is you don't get the quest giver until 3/4 of the way through the adventure, and it's the surprise, what you may think was the villain is actually the quest giver for another villain. I guess my main problem is the villain wasn't really doing anything. He was, it wasn't like he was raising undead or subtly affecting people in the monastery or really doing anything. It's almost like you're breaking down the door and suddenly you're threatening to unleash this character, because as far as I know, he was safely entombed in this monastery, even though he still had this magic evil Orcus ring. It wasn't like he was doing anything in there, basically. But you're going in there to basically permanently put down this curse of this one character. So I think some changes that I would be making if I were running the adventure is adding either more interesting things in the dungeon or blocking off more rooms. in the dungeon, as well as making the villain a little more active, or at least the danger level more prevalent, to where maybe he was subtly affecting things in the monastery, making things go evil, or maybe some undead creatures were being raised or something, to where he was affecting things to give the players more of a reason. I mean, yeah, they might want to save Queen Kara, but it just seems kind of odd that, like, I don't know, otherwise this Thessalon character is just kind of safely entombed in the thing. It doesn't feel like a threat to anybody else. One thing that you will notice as I'm flipping through here, which I do like the layout, it doesn't look like a 5e, official adventure. It doesn't use the standard layouts, font and color schemes and things we've used, but what it does here is look very nice. The maps are fine. They kind of lack the detail that I like from, big fancy drawn maps, but I think the grid map does have color, does have some detail on it, works pretty well. We do get separate player map versions of these maps. We also get separate images of a lot of the pictures that are in here, which I kind of like the pictures here. I have one minor complaint of if you're going to use stock art, which, totally fine. I'm in the minority in that I review hundreds of products and I see a lot of the same stock art, but most people don't, and stock art is there for, to help fill out art for your product. But maybe don't use the same one like in the product right here, and especially like almost back to back. At least, like, I don't know, flip it or do something else different with it. That kind of looks a little junky. But what I do like is notice how there are descriptions for every single room in this mega dungeon. That is crazy impressive. I love having those, read aloud DM descriptions, especially when they do a great job of really setting the tone and feeling of an area, while also describing obviously all the important details that's inside. Even with empty rooms, the designer really wants you to be immersed into this dungeon and really feel and hear and smell everything that's going on. I really love the way these are very well written, and the fact that we get, I mean, what did I say, a 40 plus room dungeon? There's literally one of these for every single room, which is nuts. I didn't even think you get that for official D&D campaigns. They might give you descriptions on most rooms, but probably not all of them. So that is a huge thumbs up and very, very impressive. All right, let's go over my pros and cons, even though I just already went over one pro for the Buried Palace. Pro, a huge dungeon crawl based on a real-world buried Roman palace. I think that's a cool idea to do a series, presumably it's a series, it says Real Dungeons #1, based on kind of real-world, what we consider dungeons. And obviously dungeons aren't literal, like, where we keep prisoners and stuff, but it's just it's usually a self-contained enclosed area with adventure where adventure can be found, where monsters lair, treasure can be found, problems are occurring out of those are all considered dungeons basically. And to base that on real world locations, I think there's a lot of merit there. This one feels, I don't want to say like an obvious choice, but like maybe there are more different, interesting, exotic dungeons to be found, but like I don't know how many more you can do based on real world locations, but I'd be interested to see what other ones the designer is planning on, because this one unfortunately feels a little bland. Just when you look at the whole context of D&D adventure dungeon crawls, yeah, having an underground, like, buried noble's palace automatically doesn't lend itself necessarily to an interest compared to a lot of more exotic locations. I guess it's better than the generic cave location, for example. But it's interesting. Pro, over 40 descriptions for every room. I don't need to repeat myself on that one, but I really think that's a cool addition, is to include those read aloud texts, and have that be for a huge dungeon like this is very impressive. Pro, a satisfying mystery surrounding the buried palace and its occupants. I think the backstory is really interesting. The way that it is told through talking to the monks, and then you get very critically a note that hopefully your PCs find in one of these rooms early on, where it's you're learning about this Queen Kara, who's been, cursed and killing people, and it's very creepy. And then hopefully you talk to the ghost, who can tell you more of the situation, and then you'll eventually talk to Queen Kara. Well, hopefully you'll learn more of the situation. But I like that it unravels, and you slowly realize that she's not the real villain here. She's a victim, and it's actually the entombed monk that everybody venerates who is the real villain here, even though he doesn't actually have anything to do with the current. It was all in the past. You're just kind of trying to fix a current event. I just wish he was doing more to make it a little more interesting. Final Pro, it's a fun final boss fight. I like this boss fight where the Revenant pops out, the Crawling Claw pops out, you have to wrestle. You know, initially you thought maybe you'd have to pin him down and just put the ring on, but no, his claws crawling around everywhere. Meanwhile, he's attacking and casting spells, a swarm of rats is popping out. It feels like a pretty epic, satisfyingly climactic final battle with this villain, even if the villain doesn't really pertain to the story too much. Also, if you've got that ghost character and you make it to 5 rounds, which is pretty long in D&D terms, it also can join, which is pretty nice. All right, cons. I kind of just wrapped up all my cons into one point, which is that the dungeon is oversized and underdeveloped ultimately. I've kind of been reiterating this whole time, but there's just too many rooms that are just empty. There's nothing going on there. It's just players walking into a room, you read the description, and there's nothing else going on. There's no real loot to find. There's no interesting like notes to find. There's no monsters to battle. There's just not enough content here to where I wish the designer had either A, halved the size of this dungeon, would have solved a lot of problems, or B, if you want to have it be this big, you just got to add more stuff for there to have happen. And I think the best way to do that would have been to make the villain be affecting other people a little bit more through scripted encounters. Don't just rely on these, random tables, because that's to me that's kind of a cheat almost. You just want to throw those in there. Like add some scripted events, add some undead being summoned, or in this room this specifically happens, because otherwise it just comes off as being a little bit too empty and unfortunately rather boring, despite the kind of cool introductory sequence that occurred and the cool ending. So I think it begins and ends rather well. It's the middle part, which is unfortunately the bulk of the adventure that I have a problem with. Final verdict: intriguingly inspired by a real-world ancient Roman palace, the Buried Palace needs to take more liberties with fantasy and adventure to avoid being as dry as its buried walls. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Thank you.